The late Ian McNeill, official historian of Australian land operations in South Vietnam, once proposed the title "A Province for a Battlefield" for his second volume. Ian's reference was to Phuoc Tuy, which was the focus of Australian efforts in Vietnam from 1966 to 1971. But his proposed title would also function as a description of the way in which Australia's war in Afghanistan was fought and subsequently remembered. Just as they have served to determine Australia's principal areas of operations in Vietnam, alliance relations, political imperatives, risk tolerances, and practical military concerns of capability, capacity and sustainment resulted in the southern province of Uruzgan being the focus of Australia's operations from its re-engagement in Afghanistan in 2005 to its withdrawal of major forces in 2013. Uruzgan, with its stark, rugged terrain and resilient but complicated population, defined the Australian experience of Afghanistan. As Fred Smith observed in 2010, and I quote, "We get caught up in this little province only a mother could love, and we start to care about it," unquote. We have to be cautious, however, that Australia's operational focus on Uruzgan does not lead us to repeat the tone and scope of much of the historiography of Australia's war in Vietnam, and lead us to fashion a narrative about Afghanistan that is parochial, founded on exceptionalism and devoid of context. In a more practical sense, and I address this primarily to the military, diplomatic and political professionals in the audience, a narrow focus on Uruzgan denies us the benefits of the experience of others and has the potential to leave us ignorant of the challenges of coalition warfare. So this afternoon, I'll sketch out some of that coalition context. How the command, Regional Command South, to which Australia returned to Afghanistan in 2005, was assembled, how it functioned, and what Australia and Uruzgan's significance was within it. The underlying logic of ISAF's expansion beyond Kabul was that sustainable governance could not be brought to Afghanistan, thus permanently denying it as a haven for terrorists without its mandate being extended to the whole country. Thus, in 2003, in combination with NATO's agreement to assume responsibility for the mission, a plan was developed that would see it progressively expand between 2004 and 2006 into 5 regional commands. While the immediate concern for NATO was to elicit national contributions and allocate real estate, the move was underpinned by 2 interrelated imperatives. The first, to demonstrate NATO's credibility as a functional military alliance and a global actor, and the second, to keep the United States engaged. To stabilise the whole of Afghanistan would require United States troops, but to trigger an increased deployment, its NATO allies would need to make significant commitments of their own. The process involved much diplomatic horse trading and highlighted a divide among NATO nations that would continue to blight relationships within the coalition. The further the plans moved around the clock face, the less volunteers presented themselves. In particular, many NATO stalwarts refused to consider deployment in southern Afghanistan, where American forces still operated as part of Operation Enduring Freedom. The combat mission of these forces was regarded as incompatible with ISAF's reconstruction agenda. Ironically, some NATO members were also concerned that a quick expansion into the south of Afghanistan would result in a rapid United States withdrawal, thereby depriving ISAF of key enablers. The south, and in particular the province of Kandahar, however, could not be avoided. Kandahar, and Kandahar city within it, was and remains the key to southern Afghanistan. Kandahar is the heartland of the Pashtun people who have dominated Afghan politics for hundreds of years and was the birthplace of the Taliban. Kandahar city, which was the Taliban capital until its flight in the face of coalition offensive operations in December 2002, is the second largest city in Afghanistan and in 2010 had an estimated population of around 1 million people. It stands at the western end of the historical trade route to Quetta in current-day Pakistan, where the surviving members of the Taliban government established a council of leaders, known as the Quetta Shura, that from 2002 began infiltrating fighters back into Afghanistan. Their mission was to exploit intertribal rivalry and popular discontent with the predatory rule of local warlords come government officials and the perceived excesses of coalition troops, and to reassert Taliban influence. From Kandahar city by road, it's just 238 kilometres to Quetta. Kabul is 496 kilometres away. For a multinational effort committed to a unified Afghanistan ruled from Kabul, Kandahar was the vital ground. Furthermore, with a coalition base already established at Kandahar airfield, the province offered a secure point of entry and a logistics hub. Aware of both the South's significance and their allies' reluctance to go there, key proponents of ISAF's expansion, such as the United Kingdom and Canada, realised that they would need to lead the way, and the laydown of Regional Command South was determined in discussions throughout 2004, shaped by interlocking political and military imperatives. The United Kingdom, which had long sought more extensive Canadian involvement in NATO, first engaged Canada in early 2004. It had initially envisaged Kandahar as the destination for its troops, but rapidly conceded the province to Canada when it became apparent that the Canadians also favoured a deployment there. Britain instead sidestepped west into Helmand. The key feature of the province is the river of the same name, which irrigates a green zone once described as a potential breadbasket for Afghanistan. In 2005, its main crop, however, was opium poppy, which accounted for 25% of nationwide production. At the Bonn Conference in 2001, the United Kingdom had been appointed the counter-narcotics lead for Afghanistan, and it has been suggested that this played a role in the British decision to go to Helmand. Canada, seeking to keep faith with the United States after declining to participate in its proposed ballistic missile defence system, was seeking a prominent continuing role in Afghanistan. It had offered NATO a PRT in late 2003, but had passed up on two opportunities to deploy it as part of Stage 2 of ISAF's expansion. In the first instance, being suspicious of a proposed partnership with the Italians in Herat, and in the second, dissatisfied with the likely obscurity of a base in the central Afghanistan town of Chagcharan. Furthermore, Canada's army already knew Kandahar, having operated in the province in 2002 as part of Operation Enduring Freedom, and elements of the army's leadership favoured a robust role in order to reorient from a peacekeeping-centric outlook. The Netherlands, which had been eyeing Kandahar for a long time, approached the United Kingdom in late 2004 with a view to making a proactive claim on the province. It was unaware, however, that a deal had already been stitched up by Canada for Kandahar, and a Rusgan, in which a like-minded partner was considered essential due to the access the province provided to its more southerly neighbours, was offered in its stead. Nervous of routes into a Rusgan from the east, the Dutch campaigned unsuccessfully for a strong US presence in Zabul, which would eventually host a Romanian battle group. Operating independently of NATO, the United Kingdom, Canada and the Netherlands had hammered out the force laydown of Regional Command South before ISAF's Phase 2 expansion was complete. Command would be rotated between the three nations, with Canada taking the first turn, replicating the shared command arrangements of Multinational Division Southwest that had been in place in Bosnia between 2000 and 2002. And you see there the blue line being the final boundaries of Regional Command South. The narrative of Australia's decision to recommit forces to Afghanistan is usually cast in terms of a response to United States diplomatic overtures and thus as an act of alliance maintenance. While this was indeed a factor, other influences were also at work. The importance of maintaining historical partnerships aside from those with the US were discussed in the 2000 Defence White Paper. The United Kingdom was a stalwart supporter of Australia's intervention in East Timor, sponsored the Security Council resolution that authorised Interfet, and provided additional combat power in the form of an infantry company group in time for the first deployment. Moreover, in early 2005, the United Kingdom had also played a key role in engineering the deployment of the Al Matana Task Group into southern Iraq, which had then served under British command. As Australia's head of defence staff in London at the time observed, quote, "The British thought they were on a winner once they had snared us into Iraq," unquote. The United Kingdom lobbied vigorously for Australian involvement in southern Afghanistan, and the subject was raised even before the El-Mutana deal was sealed, in talks between Australian Defence Minister Robert Hill and his United Kingdom counterpart Geoff Hoon in January 2005. The United Kingdom's original hope was for an Australian contribution to Helmand, but as several speakers mentioned yesterday, once it became apparent that the Netherlands' contribution rested on a credible partner in Uruzgan, Australia was manoeuvred into filling this role. We must remember, however, that small but not insubstantial numbers of Australians did serve with the British Army in Helmand in short and long-term exchange positions and as part of the artillery troop that deployed between 2008 and 2011. Australian troops were a sought-after commodity. I was told by several Canadian officers serving with Task Force Kandahar headquarters in 2008 that Canada had also floated an Australian partnership in Kandahar. I've never seen any reference to this in print, although, as was pointed out yesterday, Australia had many suitors during this period. Perhaps vindicating one of the Canadian Army's motivations for a more active role in Afghanistan, one senior Australian officer observed, quote, "We weren't overly keen about the Canadians because of their overemphasis on peacekeeping and not serious warfighting," unquote. Given the emphasis on finding like-minded partners to deploy into Regional Command South, the intent would seem to have been to provide the basis for coordinated action across the southern provinces. But a combination of national agendas and caveats, poor command and control infrastructure, shortages of personnel and equipment, and the husbanding thereof, and corrosive misunderstandings and distrust undermined this goal. Fault lines appeared early. In the Afghan spring and summer of 2006, coalition forces were hard-pressed by an aggressive Taliban. British forces were strung out among a series of isolated outposts in the northern Helmand Valley, and the Canadians fought a succession of bruising encounters with a dug-in enemy that was prepared to stand and fight. Troops were shuttled around as RC South was stretched thin, and recriminations flowed thick and fast. The Canadians accused the Dutch and the British of being reluctant to fight, and US officers claimed that the Canadians lacked aggression. Criticism didn't always follow national lines. Lieutenant General David Richards, the British commander of ISAF, noted with frustration in his diary that the British had, quote, "to be brought kicking and screaming to the party," unquote, as ISAF fought to muster forces to respond to over 1,000 Taliban fighters that assembled in Kandahar's Panjwai district. Over 2007 and 2008, the various Regional Command South task forces developed into what have been described as a series of fiefdoms, waging 4 provincially based national campaigns. This state of affairs was epitomised by the nicknames given to each of the provinces: Helmand Shire, Kandahar and Uruzdam. Each PRT responded principally to the direction from its respective national capital, and officials in country lobbied the relevant Afghan ministers in Kabul for assistance to its province, including the allocation of newly created Kandaks to bolster Afghan National Security Force numbers. In The Dust of Uruzgan, Fred Smith recounts an anecdote about the reaction of an Afghan official to a visit by Australian representatives. Quote, "On their arrival, the local bureaucrat had sighed and said, 'Are you Australian? You must be here to talk about Uruzgan.'" Uruzgan had its own internal divisions. One senior staff officer in RC South subsequently observed, quote, "The Australians saw themselves as an independent actor and did what they thought was right. They weren't much interested in regional plans and they were good at finding a fight," unquote. Initially, the commander of RC South was not empowered to give comprehensive guidance to national contingents within the command. National caveats, both stated and unstated, limited what contingents could be asked to do and where they could do it. The Dutch were perhaps the most constrained, with the political environment in the Netherlands meaning that Task Force Uruzgan was subject to intense political scrutiny. All operations with the possibility of contact with the enemy or the probability of confrontation had to be approved in The Hague. Dutch officers thus had to be able to tell a good story to gain approval, and acted preemptively by declining ISAF missions they didn't think would be approved at home, thereby contributing to the view held by others in the force, including many Australians, that they were unduly timid or passive. Australia's own caveats on deployment outside of Oruzgan that applied both to Australian conventional and special forces frustrated some in RC South. In a round of interviews within RC South headquarters in 2009, I repeatedly heard disbelief about the fact that the Australian Prime Minister had to be consulted to have the Australian forces build a bridge outside of Oruzgan. RC South headquarters itself, however, was not resourced sufficiently in order to exert much control on operations. It had few organic enablers and functioned essentially as a clearinghouse for the for providing support from ISAF assets. Furthermore, Regional Command South did not have sole control of its battle space. Operation Enduring Freedom forces were still operating in the south, and a universal frustration amongst the conventional force elements in all of the provincial task forces was the continuing presence of these forces without little control. The situation that prevailed by the start of 2009 was essentially that Regional Command South was fixed in place. A phrase had arisen about cutting the grass, where units would clear through an area, then they would not have the combat power to be able to hold it, withdraw, the Taliban would go back. 2009 was a watershed year in the history of ISAF's operations in Afghanistan. There's a recognition that the campaign was under-resourced, poorly coordinated, and going nowhere fast. The year saw the arrival of the first significant United States reinforcements since the invasion of Iraq, and the commitment of another 17,000 more across the next year by President Obama. ISAF's command and control arrangements were reorganised with the formation of an operational level headquarters and the unification of ISAF and Operation Enduring Freedom. Following on from the recommendations of General Stanley McChrystal's report of late August, an ISAF campaign plan was developed based on what was referred to as a population-centric counterinsurgency approach, with 5 lines of operation: protect the population, enable Afghan security forces, neutralise malign influence, support the extension of governance, and support socio-economic development. Regional Command South was designated as the main effort. Under the command of Dutch Major General Mart de Kruijff, Headquarters Regional Command South was expanded and its planning processes and battle rhythm revised. A combined joint operations centre was also constructed in order to allow it to better monitor and support operations across the command. In particular, a synchronisation process provided the foundations for coordinating task force operations to achieve a combined effect across the command. During 2009, the command also received a number of enablers that increased its capacity to support task force operations, thereby increasing the headquarters' significance to them. Most notable was the arrival of a United States Combat Aviation Brigade, which brought with it 140 helicopters. The significance of this deployment can be gauged by the fact that it trebled the number of helicopters in Afghanistan. Designation as the ISAF main effort brought with it priority access to additional ISAF, principally United States assets, including air support, intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance elements, and also elements of Task Force Paladin, the counter-IED task force. Most significant were the troop reinforcements, principally United States Army and United States Marines that flowed in, which speaks to Admiral Barry's remarks yesterday about how significantly the task in Afghanistan was underestimated, and saw the strength of Regional Command South grow from 22,360 in January 2009 to 65,000 in June of 2010, when issues of span of command and United States inter-service politics saw Helmand and Nimruz separated into a separate Regional Command Southwest under the command of United States Marine Corps General Richard Mills. In the spring of 2009, in the Afghan spring of 2009, Regional Command South commenced the development of a 24-month campaign plan founded on reconnecting the population with governance, and the focus was on the major population centres of Kandahar City and its environs and central Helmand, which constituted 80% of the population in the south and included the centres of major economic activity. The intent was to protect these, to control the border crossings to the south and east, and ensure freedom of movement between these key areas along the major mobility corridors. The implementation of this plan fell to Major General Nick Carter, who commanded Regional Command South through 2010. 2010 was the most intensive period of activity in the campaign in southern Afghanistan. Operation Mushtarak was aimed at securing central Helmand and was launched in February of that year and featured the largest heli-borne insertion since the Vietnam War, and it was followed by a comprehensive civil military effort in Kandahar beginning in July, which was codenamed Hamkari. Uruzgan, under this plan, became an economy of force effort. Australian commanders accepted the necessity of such prioritisation, but there remained a tension between coalition and national imperatives, as is highlighted by General Cantwell's reflections on his meeting with General Carter. And I quote, "The most important is my encounter with the British two-star general in command of the whole region of Afghanistan, Major Nick Carter. Uruzgan province falls within his command, and I must establish a good working relationship with him to ensure that we get the right level of support and that our mission is properly understood and aligned with the troubled south of the country. We get off to a good start, although I sense we will not be friends. His attention is firmly and understandably on combat operations in Helmand province to the west of Kandahar, where thousands of British troops are fighting alongside US Marines in the most bloody and brutal combat area in Afghanistan. In the months ahead, I will be a frequent visitor to Carter's office in a bid to ensure vital resources are not bled away from our area of responsibility." Australia was not unique in this regard. At the end of 2009, the United Kingdom had withdrawn the troops that provided Regional Command South's only reserve, the Regional Command South Battle Group. Although British officers on the headquarters argued that it offered twice the effect, if not fixed in place, holding ground, and it was free to be deployed where and when required, they were informed that the role could not be sold politically while British forces remained hard-pressed in Helmand. 2010, in many ways, also, it is the high point of Regional Command South operations. That in the middle of that year, the Dutch withdrew, the Canadians announced their own intention to draw down their forces from 2011, and the increasing presence of United States troops meant that the next rotation of command of the headquarters would be the commander of the 10th Mountain Division, and not from the original partners who set it up. So if we had to look at an assessment of where did Australia ultimately fit in this campaign plan. The first answer that staff from Regional Command South and our alliance partners would say, well, Australia provided another flag. They provided another flag in a tough part of Afghanistan where very few alliance partners were prepared to go. They also speak highly of the troops that Australia trained during our time in Uruzgan. 4 Brigade was rated as well-trained and capable. In terms of Australia's relationship with Uruzgan and its relationship to the rest of the campaign, they explain the significance of this in conventional military terms. Uruzgan and Australia's presence there was an important operation enabling the divisional main effort. That it denied safe haven to insurgents that may have acted elsewhere, although we may debate that knowing what we know about the sense of the local nature of a lot of Afghanistan's insurgents. They fixed forces in place. They allowed for the division to conduct manoeuvre operations in the main and economic corridor. Most importantly, what they will acknowledge is the effect during Mushtarak and Hamkari of the operations of the Australian Special Forces in Shawali Kot, which provided a material contribution to denying insurgent movement corridors into the north of Kandahar, thereby taking pressure off Allied operations, particularly in the Arghandab Valley. What is often overlooked, though, and our alliance partners will often speak of, and it goes back to earlier papers about earlier references to embedded staff, that they will also reference the intellectual contribution made by the embedded staff officers within Regional Command South, particularly in the years of its expansion. That one of the officers who started to develop the Regional Command South campaign plan in 2009 was an Australian. The headquarters worked well, and it emphasised the value of those traditional partnerships. One officer described it as being essentially an ABCA, which is the Australia, Britain, Canada, Australia Standardisation Agreement headquarters, that its officers spoke the same language, they understood the same doctrine, they understood each other. In closing, let me make a visual point. By 2013, it was difficult for the untrained eye to differentiate between the troops of the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, and many other national contingents in Afghanistan. Derivations of Crye Precision Multicam had become the camouflage pattern of choice, and soldiers were similarly bundled up in ballistic eyewear, enhanced combat helmets, and lightened body armour festooned with pouches. This observation points to the universality of the experience in Afghanistan. Although the level of activity varied, troops essentially faced the same enemy and the same challenges. I would suggest that 12 years of coalition operations influenced national military cultures, doctrine and operational practices, and fused ideas and values. In Afghanistan, Australians formed part of a coalition that at its zenith included 100,000 troops. To fully exploit what that coalition has to tell us about the experience of war and the complexity of multinational operations, it needs to be examined not just in national chunks, but in a whole. I hope that today I've demonstrated that just as there is no room for exceptionalism in sound history, there is little place for it in effective coalition operations. Thanks very much.